I will likely not. I don't think I'll be fishing, but you never know. All right, well, with some of that aside, let's move on to Corinthians as we finish up chapter 5 today. Remember that yesterday we saw Paul kind of take the church to task in general terms, but specifically around a situation in which there was a kind of immorality that was happening that they were permitting. They were being overly permissive, and they were not as upset as Paul certainly was and thought they should be. So we come back around to some of that as we finish this chapter. I wrote to you in my letter not to associate with sexually immoral persons. Not at all, meaning the immoral of the world, or the greedy and robbers or idolaters, since then you would need to go out of the world. But I'm now writing to you not to associate with anyone who bears the name brother or sister, who is sexually immoral or greedy, or is an idolater, reviler, drunkard, or robber. Do not even eat with such one. For what have I to do with judging those outside? Is it not those who are inside that you are to judge? God will judge those outside. Drive out the wicked person from among you. So a couple of things here, and the first is probably the least important topically, but when we read a letter called 1 Corinthians, it is interesting to know that it is actually not the first letter that Paul has written. This reference here, I wrote to you in my letter, seems to indicate that there has been a previous communication. It is possible that he's talking about the paragraphs just immediately preceding this, but that seems unlikely. It is more likely that there is an actual 1 Corinthians, which we've lost track of, and this letter is now labeled as first, though it was second. There are some who think that this first letter is folded in to parts of 1st and 2nd Corinthians. But the point is, Paul has an ongoing relationship with the Corinthians, and he believes he has been consistent in his advice to them. And it is pretty clear. Do not associate with the sexually immoral person. And I don't know, Michael, this idea of separation is, I think, troubling. I think for most of us, there's a kind of heaviness in the idea of drawing lines. Most of us do whatever we can to avoid that. And so the idea that a church would sort of say, you're out, is not really a part of our experience. And I think it's I think it's a difficult thing to consider.
Right. There's a sense in which the church has historically thrown out the baby with the bathwater on some level here, because if we're going to be honest, the church has a long track record of throwing out people that are a nuisance or people that are saying things the church doesn't like. I mean, if you look in church history, the church has exercised authority, and a lot of times it's done that. We would look back on it and we would have some shame and guilt for the action that we took. And, from a reform perspective, Clint, I think we've got to confess that as we seek to judge, in fact, we have this thing, for what do I have to do to judge those outside? It's not those that are inside that you are to judge. A reformed person's immediately going to turn and say, whoa, who am I to judge even the ones inside? And I do think there's some wisdom and context that brings, just the awareness that if we ever find ourselves sitting in the judge's seat, that's a great moment for us to ask some questions about our motives and about some of the things behind that. That said, we should not shrink back from the reality that that Paul has real expectations for this community about what it looks like to be a person who lives in right relationship first with God, but then in effect from that with others, and that to have an association with those inside the faith who are living in outward sin, for Paul, is a reflection that not only are you tolerating a person who's living outside of God's plan, you're actually bringing within the community this whole image of leaven that we had yesterday. You're bringing within the community a force that will destabilize the rest of the community. That if you're willing to put up with that kind of licentiousness, then you're going to see that affect other parts of the community's life. And so we've got to be very sort of wise in our way of evaluating this. No, Christians shouldn't set themselves in the judge's seat and begin proctoring sort of judgments against everything that we don't like. That would not be wise. And it would also not be wise to say that there are no boundaries or guide rails, or that there are no sort of moral expectations for the Christian community, because that too is not a mark of the gospel being at root. So I think we have to walk carefully here, but we can't shrink back from it completely.
I've always amused is not the right word. I've always been kind of appreciated, let me say it that way. I've always appreciated the Bible, and particularly the New Testament, has a way of separating church from world. And here's what I mean by that. If you say to the Bible, man, those non-Christians are rough. They sometimes they can't be trusted. Sometimes they do things that are immoral. Sometimes they take advantage of people. The Bible will always say, "Yep, yeah, of course they do. That's what people do. That's what sinful means." When you say though, "Oh, those people in the church, they're sexually immoral. They're greedy. They're taking advantage of each other." It's at this point that the Bible becomes sort of shocked. The Bible reacts to that differently. And I think sometimes in the church we've been guilty of saying we think the standards we try to have for ourselves should apply to everyone. We should make them live to our standards. Well, it doesn't really work because our standards are based in Jesus Christ. And so for the person outside of Christ, they don't understand what we're saying. But that's not the question. For Paul, the question is, you who are inside and understand the standards, how can you act like that? Yes, they act like that. That's what people who don't follow Jesus Christ do, because that's what sin looks like. But what about you? And so what do I have to do with the outside world? Yes, the outside world is broken. Of course it is. What about the church? And I appreciate that Paul doesn't here give you the idea that he stands in judgment over the world, but instead that he demands better of those inside the church, that he demands that there must be an observable and tangible difference between the way people act when they don't know Jesus and the way people act when they do know Jesus. And again, that's a really challenging, pointed kind of text, but I find it helpful as it challenges us to consider what our standard is and where we look to for our moral, ethical guidance.
So I want to give this as an example. I think Amazon does this on their Kindle books. Other places do this as well. Have you ever seen a thing where it'll show you like highlighted the words that have been highlighted most often? Or sometimes they have these little like mind maps, and you see sort of the words that have been referenced most from an article, that kind of thing. I just want to caution us, because whenever you read Paul, the temptation is to fixate on one thing in a list of things that's particularly culturally or personally resonant with you. With this list, it's the very first thing I think that a lot of us are going to be drawn to. Don't associate with anyone who's sexually immoral. That is, I mean, in our culture, in our world, in our own Presbyterian circles, we spend a lot of time talking about what it means to be prudent and to live rightly sexually. I'd point out the rest of this list, though. Maybe you don't find yourself in error in that category. What about greedy? What about drunkard, reviler, idolater? What about robber, right? Paul always does this in his lists, and I love it. He combines these things that we just don't think go together, right? We don't think sexually immoral or greedy. Wait, what, Paul? I mean, greedy? Because in our culture, it's perfectly acceptable to go to a mall and look at a whole bunch of windows at stuff that we really want to have and to preserve our resources so that we can have more of what we want than giving to another person. I don't mean to be pointed, other than just to say, just because one thing might stick out to you in a list, I think that is actually evidence of looking deeper at the other things on the list, because it's going to be very hard to become that judge who leverages, or who not leverages, a judge who lodges sort of a complaint against others when you recognize that the other things on that list are most certainly at some point connecting with your own life. I mean, ultimately, we all stand as judge because we all have sin operative within us. And so, once again, just because that's true doesn't mean the church shouldn't take seriously a life that reflects the grace given to us in Jesus Christ. We saw that in Romans. Should we keep on sinning so that grace can abound so much more? Absolutely not. No, that would be crazy. No, we live rightly because of the gift given freely. And if we always start with the gift, then the judgment stuff will work itself later. In this case, though, it appears that the Corinthians just took grace as sort of constant permission. We should be able to allow anything that we want within the church because everything is covered under this large umbrella. Here, Paul makes it very clear, absolutely not. We must be refereeing what's happening, because if not, we're going to look no different than the world we're called to be separate from.
I think we take for granted sometimes that the church is a place of openness and tolerance, and hopefully that's true. I think we forget, though, that there is sometimes a tension in that the church is not a place where you can say and do anything you want. That while there is room for everyone, there are also expectations. And so the elephant in the room here, and the thing that I think we have to handle very carefully is this idea, do not even eat with such a one. Cut them off. And that is, again, if we keep in mind what we heard Paul say earlier in the week, in the hope that they would repent, in the hope that they would change. This is not the freedom. This is not permission to simply build walls between anyone we disagree with. This is the church trying to ensure some degree of purity and of standard within a community. And when someone continuously, repeatedly, and willfully says, I will not abide by that, then the church finds itself in a situation of saying, then you're not really with us. You're not really inside the community, because as we follow Jesus Christ, we look to him for guidance, and you seem to be thinking that you have a different set of rules, a different set of standards, and we can't really call you one of ours. It sounds very unloving, but I don't think that is Paul's intention. And I also want to say that if you understand that this is only one part of the New Testament, there is much more to be said along these lines, and this represents getting to the far end of what the Bible. So this is the exhaustion of all the other options, and we don't start here, and I think that's important.
Yeah, very much. It's going to be tempered, actually, when we continue next week. This next section is actually, in some ways, even more applicable than the section that comes before. So there's actually a sense in which that may be harder as we turn to it than what we've had. But I do want to point out here that ultimately, living between the guardrails as a community only helps the community as a whole. And we as a church have to confess the places where we've allowed not just members of the church, but leaders of the church to stray far beyond the guardrails. We've not we've not been transparent. We've had situations where we've seen embarrassing headlines of what people who call themselves Christian leaders even have done. And ultimately, it's not about the church leveraging judgment against another person. Ultimately, this verse 13, God will judge here those outside. Ultimately, God will judge all. But we should fundamentally have expectations, because it is within those expectations that people grow and flourish. And I can't help but not turn to the analogy of a child again. As you're seeking to help a child make a way in the world, there's something inherently good in them knowing you hit a boundary, you hit the wall. You can't go any further than that, because that helps you realize that. I love, I have this conversation with Emily all the time. My 10-year-old believes that as an adult, since you're free, you can do whatever you want. And I've asked her, so what do you think you would do if you had that freedom? And every time she says, I would eat ice cream whenever I want. I would go to the mall and spend as much money as I wanted, and I'd pay someone to do my chores for me. And I think, wouldn't that be great? You could eat ice cream with no consequence. You'd never do any actual work, right? But of course, we realize that's not a healthy life. I mean, ultimately, we do need to live. Even if you could eat ice cream for every meal of every day, you shouldn't, because you won't feel good and it won't provide the nutrition that you need to be healthy. I mean, the same goes for these other things, that ultimately we find something restorative and rejuvenative in living within the order that God created. And you're only going to find it if you're surrounded by a family of faith who takes that seriously enough to try to encourage others along the way. Now, how we do that requires wisdom. How we seek to provide that sort of order and structure requires thought. But friends, let's not pretend like it shouldn't exist. Let's not run from it. And there is a creative tension that you speak of there, Clint. One last thing here. End of verse 13, drive out the wicked person from among you. I just want to point out that appears to be a reference from Deuteronomy 17:7. And it's just striking to me that here Paul can't help himself when addressing an issue in a largely Gentile church to be referencing Deuteronomy texts that they may or may not know. I mean, they may not even immediately be able to turn to recognize this passage, and yet Paul is thinking Old Testament, New Testament. He's thinking the scriptures that he memorized and is an expert in, and he's thinking about who Jesus Christ is and how that transforms our world, and he's always combining these together. And so I don't have a lot to say other than to just say there's so much happening in texts like this. Don't get fixated on just one small part. There's a lot happening here.
Yeah, and I think, again, the simple truth is there are things that don't belong in the church. And Paul says they should be out. And if there are people who practice those things unrepentantly, then they perhaps can't stay. That they pose a threat. And this is not judgment in the sense of eternal judgment. This is judgment in the sense that doesn't belong here. I was in a conversation, a debate once while in seminary regarding some ordination stuff, and I remember a comment was made kind of making the point that people have been ordained and made mistakes, and someone said, trying to make their point, well, there are men who have been ordained and they have affairs and they still get to be pastors. And I think the point was, sort of the accusation was, well, nobody cares if they have affairs. And I said, I think it's a very different thing to say, I've made these mistakes and I repent of them. But my response was, I submit to you that if I stand before a presbytery and say, I cheat on my wife and I plan to keep cheating on my wife and you can't stop me, there is in fact no way they're going to ordain me as a pastor. I mean, there are things that don't belong. It doesn't mean that we don't make mistakes. It means when we elevate our will over God's will, we have put ourselves outside of faithful practice. And when we do that in the context of the church, it can be very dangerous, and I think Paul takes that seriously here. Not comfortable words, but good words, challenging words, and important words.
Well, friends, hopefully there's something in there that makes sense of a relatively challenging text. We look forward to continuing with you next week. I think it'd be a little bit of a lie to say that it gets a lot easier.
We'll circle back to...
Yeah, I mean, there's some ground to travel here, but it's good ground.
We're going to be on ethical stuff for a little while.
So
have a good weekend.
See you later.
Thank you for joining us for this daily Bible study. If this is your first time, welcome. We are so glad that you have joined us for this time of intentional study of God's Word. You will find in the description of this video a link to our website. We would love to get to know who you are. We'd love to reach out and greet you personally, but be sure, whether or not this is your first time, to like this video. If you're on Facebook, share it so that other people might be able to find it too. If you're on YouTube, consider subscribing. You'll receive more content like this every day at 2 o'clock Central Standard Time. On top of that, every Wednesday at 9 o'clock, we release a Pastor Talk podcast, which goes through different series, but all of them about faith and life and discipleship of Jesus Christ. Friends, regardless of how many times you've been with us, we hope that this day has been meaningful for you as you seek to follow Jesus Christ. So until next time, be blessed. We look forward to seeing you soon.